Voi dovete impedire che un pugno di ruffiani e di frodatori riesca a imbrattare l'Italia. Tutte le azioni necessarie assolva la legge di Roma.
E l'arte è la più nobile delle imprese.
E qui riuscì a rivedere le stelle.
Le storie e le azioni degli uomini eccellenti.
Dobbiamo meritarcela, la storia che ci è capitata. Qualcuno ce l'ha pagata. Non fu gratis.
E il naufragare è dolce in questo mare.
Tanto maggiori sono gli ostacoli e tanto più precisi e dritta deve essere la nostra volontà di superarli.
Io direi che è stato creato un grande patrimonio che appartiene alla collettività nazionale, appartiene a tutti gli italiani.
Introduction. I've noticed for a long time that many liberals, including communists, just don't understand fascism. They use terrible authors like Umberto Eco or Robert Paxton, whose understanding of fascism is so vague that liberals like Joe Biden could be considered fascist. The communists Michael Parenti and R. Palm Dutt both use fabrications to equate fascism with brutal bourgeois violence and ideological contradictions. They paint a picture of fascism as a means to only save decaying capitalism. However, any legitimate research and analysis effort into the topic finds that this isn't accurate whatsoever. The history regarding fascism is so much more complicated and nuanced than these critics portray it as. And when one truly takes their time to do neutral research, they inevitably find that there is little to no evidence to back up any of these said claims. It has even come to my attention that even many self-proclaimed fascists and National Socialists also don't know the history, philosophy, or economics of the Third Way. Many seem to instead adopt the liberal caricatures of a system built on racist national capitalism. Therefore, I've decided to put together a list of what I consider the best academic resources one can study. This way, more people can understand the third position concurrently and stop using fascist and Nazi as derogatory epithets toward the political opposition they disagree with. Moreover, it should serve as an educational basis for many self-described fascists to grow in an authentic direction outside of the reactionary paradigm. With that, I hope you, my dear reader, will enjoy this reading list. Zeev Sternhell, The Birth of Fascist Ideology, From Cultural Rebellion to Political Revolution. For anyone curious about the origins of fascism and gaining insight on this debate, The Birth of Fascist Ideology is one of the best books to read. In Sternhell's view, fascism was much more than an episode in the history of Italy. He argues here that it possesses a coherent ideology with deep roots in European civilization. It can be said from reading this work that the roots of fascism come from both the right and left, and that fascism is a twisted and extreme variation of ideas from both sides of the political spectrum. For this reason, many try to argue that fascism was not a coherent ideology and was merely a reaction to the disastrous events of World War I. But as Sternhell notes, fascism developed over a period of several decades and had much in common with many of the intellectual currents of the time. He was disgusted with the heritage of the Enlightenment, liberal democracy, and the materialism of Marxism. Zeev Sternhell, Neither Right Nor Left, Fascist Ideology in France. This explosive book asserts that fascism was an important part of the mainstream European history, not just a temporary development in Germany and Italy, but a significant aspect of French culture as well. It shows that fascism united anti-communist, anti-liberal, nationalist, and revolutionary syndicalist thought, each of which joined in reflecting the political culture inherited from 18th century France. Sternhell shows that fascist movements were accompanied often by a search for a third way to achieve revolutionary social transformation. The intellectuals involved tended to come from two sources of thought: radical rightists who wished to reject many features of industrial society and liberal democracy, and radical leftists disillusioned with Marxism who gradually moved towards nationalism. Stephen B. Whitaker, The Anarchist, Individualist Origins of Italian Fascism. The anarchist origins of Italian fascism are vividly described in this multiple biography of 4 anarchists who demonstrated extreme individualist tendencies. Leandro Arpanati began his political career as an anarchist, but went on to lead the Bologna fascists and became Mussolini's Minister of the Interior and the second Duce of fascism. Massimo Rocca was the extreme anarchist individualist who goaded Mussolini into openly declaring his stance in favor of intervention in the First World War. Maria Ruggier was a leader among the Bologna anarchists who reshaped the revolutionary ideas of the left in terms acceptable to the right. Torquato Nani helped fuse the left wing of fascism to the right wing of Bolshevism. All were friends of the young Mussolini, but were among the first to express disillusionment with fascism. Mark Antliff, Avant-Garde Fascism. Mark Antliff examines the aesthetic dimension of fascist myth-making within the history of the avant-garde. Between 1909 and 1939, a surprising array of modernists were implicated in this project, Antliff found. Such well-known figures as the symbolist painter Maurice Denis, the architects Le Corbusier and Auguste Perret, the sculptors Charles Despiaux and Aristide Maillol, the New Vision photographer Germaine Kroll, and the Fauve Maurice Vlaminck. Antliff considers 3 French fascists, Georges Valois, Philippe Lamour, and Thierry Monnier, demonstrating how they appropriated the avant-garde aesthetics of Cubism, Futurism, Surrealism, and the so-called retour à l'ordre, return to order in French, and, in one instance, even defined the dynamism of fascist ideology in terms of Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein's theory of montage. Antliff argues that fascists use modern art as the mythical harbinger of a regenerative revolution that would overthrow existing governmental institutions, inaugurate an anti-capitalist new order, and awaken the creative and artistic potential of the fascist new man. Jeffrey Herf, Reactionary Modernism, Technology, Culture, and Politics in Weimar and the Third Reich. Jeffrey Herf explores the paradox inherent in the German fascists' rejection of the rationalism of the Enlightenment, while fully embracing modern technology. He documents evidence of a cultural tradition he calls reactionary modernism, found in the writings of German engineers and of the major intellectuals of the Weimar Right, Ernst Jünger, Oswald Spengler, Werner Sombart, Hans Freyer, Carl Schmitt, and Martin Heidegger. The book shows how German nationalism and later National Socialism created what Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, called the steel-like romanticism of the 20th century. By associating technology with the Germans rather than the Jews, with beautiful form rather than the formlessness of the market, and with a strong state rather than a predominance of economic values and institutions, these right-wing intellectuals reconciled Germany's strength with its romantic soul and national identity. Roger Griffin, Fascism. What exactly is fascism? This question has driven the work of Roger Griffin throughout his influential academic career, in books, journal articles, and at conferences. Griffin has spent a lifetime discussing and debating how fascism should be conceptualized and studied. He has made many friends and allies within the academic sphere, and has generated numerous critics too. This book was written as an accessible introduction to his method of studying fascism. It is an excellent place to start for anyone looking for a clear and nuanced way to think about the history and ideological dynamics of this much debated phenomenon. In this work, Griffin demonstrates why fascism strongly appeals to large swathes of society. It includes a wide selection of texts written by fascist thinkers and propagandists, as well as by prominent anti-fascists from both inside and outside Europe, before and after the Second World War. Included are texts on fascism in Germany and Italy, on the abortive pre-1945 fascisms in more than a dozen countries around the world, on reactions to fascism, and on post-war and contemporary fascism, with contributions from writers as diverse as Benito Mussolini and Primo Levi, Joseph Goebbels and George Orwell, Martin Heidegger and Max Horkheimer. This compelling anthology provides insight into the depths and breadths of the destructive repercussions of fascist ideology. Roger Griffin, Fascism as a Totalitarian Movement. This major volume uses a series of case studies by world experts to further our understanding of the complex issue of fascism. It examines the connections between fascism, political religion, and totalitarianism by exploring two interwar fascist regimes, two abortive European movements, and two post-war American extreme right-wing movements with contrasting religious components. The reader is presented with a wealth of work that redefines the complex concept of totalitarian movement and our understanding of generic fascism. Taken as a whole, it comprehensively analyzes the links between particular totalitarian movements and regimes and the concrete historical phenomena produced in light of current radical theories of fascism, totalitarianism, and political religion. Roger Griffin, The Nature of Fascism. The Nature of Fascism draws on the history of political, social, and psychological theory to produce a synthesis of ideas and approaches that will be invaluable for students. Roger Griffin locates the driving force of fascism in a distinctive form of utopian myth, that of the regenerated national community, destined to rise up from the ashes of a decadent society. He lays bare the structural affinity that relates fascism not only to Nazism, but to the many fascist movements that surfaced in interwar Europe and elsewhere, and traces the unabated proliferation of virulent fascist activism since 1945. Roger Griffin, A Fascist Century. 10 essays on fascism by Roger Griffin, focusing on how to understand and apply fascist ideology to various movements since the 20th century. Mussolini's prophesied fascist century includes studies on fascism's attempted temporal revolution, Nazism as an extended case study, and fascism's post-war evolution. A. James Gregor, The Ideology of Fascism, The Rationale of Totalitarianism. The Ideology of Fascism is one of the landmark works that has challenged and refuted the Marxist interpretations of fascism. It offers a very serious and thorough treatment of the theoretical presuppositions and aspirations of fascism, which the author describes as a kind of generic National Socialism. Gregor's discussion of the socialist roots of fascism is one of the most valuable aspects of this book. A. James Gregor discusses Mussolini's socialism at length, and he contrasts it with the socialism of Marx and Engels, as well as that of Lenin. In Gregor's view, both Lenin and Mussolini opted for a more elitist conception of revolution, one that required a vanguard party to guide the uncomprehending masses. One of the many interesting observations he makes is that the transition from traditional Marxist socialism, with its emphasis on international class solidarity, to National Socialism, i.e. fascism, was prompted in part by the collapse of the Second International when the various parliamentary socialist parties of Europe chose to back the war efforts of their own national governments in the First World War. Historical analysis has concluded that the bonds of nationhood were far stronger and more fundamental than those of class, and modified their political aims and appeals accordingly. Thus, this book becomes a rich source of insights into fascist thinking and Gregor's treatment of Marxism. While a side focus of this book is deeply informed in its conclusions. A. James Gregor, Young Mussolini and the Intellectual Origins of Fascism. Here, Gregor analyzes the intellectual roots of Italian fascist thought, as well as studying the development of Benito Mussolini from a young age, through his influences, and finally, his transformation into a charismatic adult leader. Gregor in this book describes fascism as a variant of classical Marxism. Thus, Gregor argues that fascism can't be identified as a form of right-wing extremism. A. James Gregor, The Faces of Janus. Fascist regimes are assigned to the right wing, while Marxist-Leninist regimes are assigned to the left. But this distinction has left us without a coherent understanding of the revolutionary history of the 20th century. A. James Gregor contends in this insightful book that the evolution of Marxist theory in the 1920s through the 1990s in the Soviet Union evolved into fascism. A. James Gregor, Marxism, Fascism, and Totalitarianism. Chapters in the Intellectual History of Radicalism. This work traces the changes in classical Marxism, the Marxism of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, that took place after the death of its founders. It outlines the variants that appeared around the turn of the 20th century, one of which was to be of influence among the followers of Adolf Hitler, another of which was to shape the ideology of Benito Mussolini, and still another of which provided the doctrinal rationale for V.I. Lenin's Bolshevism and Joseph Stalin's communism. A. James Gregor, Italian Fascism and Developmental Dictatorship. This book dispels the common myths that Italian fascism lacks any sort of ideological substance, and asserts it has much in common with other developmental revolutionary socialist regimes. A. James Gregor also refutes the Marxist claim that industrial, financial, or agrarian capitalists, or in turn, all the elements of the big financial bourgeoisie, were in collusion with Benito Mussolini to get fascism into power. A. James Gregor, Giovanni Gentile, Philosopher of Fascism. In Giovanni Gentile, Philosophy of Fascism, A. James Gregor examines the thoughts of Italian fascism's main theorist. In Gregor's reading of Gentile, fascism was, and remains, an anti-democratic reaction to what was seen to be the domination by advanced industrial democracies of less developed or status-deprived communities and nations languishing on the margins of the great powers. Sketching in the political background of late 19th century Italy, industrially backward and only recently unified, Gregor shows how Gentile supplied fascism its justificatory rationale as a developmental dictatorship. Gentile's actualism, aka actual idealism, as his philosophy came to be identified, absorbed many intellectual currents of the early 20th century, including rationalism, syndicalism, and futurism, uniting them in a dynamic rebellion against perceived hegemonic imposters of liberal imperialism. As Gregor demonstrates, it was a paradigm of what we can expect in the 21st century's response on the part of marginalized nations to the globalization of industrialized democracies. Gregor cites post-Maoist China, post-Soviet Russia, Africa, and the Balkans at the developmental stage from which fascism could grow. A. James Gregor, National Socialism and Race. This work is a serious look into the racial policies of the Third Reich and traces the entire history of these developments. It explains how the vague ideas of Adolf Hitler in the early years of his political career developed by the 1930s into an exaggerated obsession with Nordicism. This occurred quite separately and with the disapproval of many of the Nazi leadership. By the mid and late 1930s, a far more rational view of race became official Nazi Party policy. What is important about this book is that it refutes the silly myths and propaganda allegations by many historians. A. James Gregor essentially demolishes all the lurid tales of Hyperborean giants and Nordic master races. A. James Gregor, Mussolini's Intellectuals. Here, A. James Gregor argues that Italian fascism may have been a flawed system of belief, but it was neither more nor less irrational than other ideologies of the 20th century. Gregor makes this case by presenting a chronological account of the major intellectual figures of Italian fascism, tracing how the movement's ideas evolved in response to social and political developments inside and outside of Italy. Gregor's account reveals that if we want to come to grips with one of the most important political movements of the 20th century, we nevertheless need to understand that fascism had serious intellectual as well as visceral roots. A. James Gregor, Totalitarianism and Political Religion, an Intellectual History. A. James Gregor, in this work, provides a unique insight into the variants of Marxism, fascism, and National Socialism that dominated our immediate past. He explores the seeds of totalitarianism as a secular faith in the 19th century, with the goal to gain total control over every aspect of personal life and business, including education, communication, and distribution of goods. Each, therefore, becomes a totalitarian institution and, consequently, a political religion. A. James Gregor, The Search for Neo-Fascism, the Use and Abuse of Social Science. The intent of this book is both pedagogical and cautionary. Its central thesis is that terms like fascism, generic fascism, and neo-fascism are often used with considerable indifference, applied uniquely to political movements and regimes considered on the right rather than the left, intended more often to denigrate rather than inform. The result has been absolutely confusing for those who wish to understand fascism. Within that context, some of the most important political movements of post-World War II are wrongfully identified as fascist, including, among others, the Alleanza Nazionale of Italy and the Bharatiya Janata Party of India, both of which have discharged leadership roles in their respective governments. Identifying either as neo-fascist has clear implications for international relations. Emilio Gentile, The Origins of Fascist Ideology, 1918 to 1925. This masterwork by Emilio Gentile fills a broad gap in the understanding of the origins of a major political movement of the 20th century, fascism. This is an extremely detailed and definitive study of the development and initial success of fascism as it originated in Italy right after the First World War. The author traces each major influence and gives us a complete understanding of the birth of the doctrine that changed the face of Europe and found imitators of Mussolini around the world for decades. Emilio Gentile, The Sacralization of Politics in Fascist Italy. Fascism was the first and prime instance of a modern political religion, rereading signs, symbols, cults, and myths. Italy's leading scholar of fascism offers a new history of Italian nationalism as a civic religion, albeit in its extreme form, and of Italian fascism as a vital catalyst for contemporary mass politics. Emilio Gentile decodes Italy culturally, going beyond political and social dimensions that explain Italy's fascist past in terms of class, or the cynicism of its leaders, or modernizing and expansionist ambitions. Emilio Gentile, The Struggle for Modernity, Nationalism, Futurism, and Fascism. The confrontation between nationalism and modernity is one of the main keys to understanding the permutations of Italian radical nationalism, from modernist avant-gardes up to the fascist regime. This book analyzes the ideological undercurrents and cultural myths that unite all these movements, looking at Italian nationalism from its Risorgimento roots to the neo-fascist heritage. Gentile considers the relationship between myth and organization in the making of the fascist state, the role of the party, the liturgy of mass politics in Italy, the fascist organizations abroad, and the attitude of fascist culture toward the United States. Stanley G. Payne, A History of Fascism, 1914 to 1945. A History of Fascism, 1914 to 1945, by Stanley G. Payne, may be the definitive book on fascism. Payne dissects the history of fascism on a country-by-country basis for the period of 1914 through 1945, through a survey of the nations of Europe, South America, and Asia. The first thing that Payne discusses is the definition of fascism. Payne affirms that fascism did not have a philosophical core, although its tenets were eclectic. Payne found that the characteristics of fascism was ultra-nationalism based upon a desire for a national rebirth. Stanley G. Payne, Fascism, Comparison and Definition. Payne has written here a clear, fascinating exploration into the definition of fascism. Since fascism tends to be linked to a nation's culture far more than Marxism or capitalism, both of which claim a universality to their ideology. Every country which has been subjected to fascism has developed its own form. It provides fascinating details which highlight the differences between other fascist movements. Payne provides a brilliant survey of all the forms fascism has taken around the world. This clears up the understanding of what we call generic fascism. Anthony J. Joes, Fascism in the Contemporary World, Ideology, Evolution, Resurgence. It was only in the 1960s that the first specialists in fascist studies arrived on the scene. At the time, it was competing with the various Marxist interpretations of fascism, which, although no longer credible today, still linger on in people like Jason Stanley. Anthony's book, Fascism in the Contemporary World, Ideology, Evolution, and Resurgence, managed to destroy these Marxist claims back in 1979. This book is an excellent, simplified summary of the major interpretations of fascism until 1978. Most of the book still holds true, even today. The book argues that fascist-like systems are to be found in third world countries, suffering from dysfunctional governments, lost wars, collective humiliation, and economic backwardness. Renzo De Felice, Interpretations of Fascism. This work offers a typology of the forms of power that generic fascism assumed and examines the ways in which writers since the 1920s have perceived fascism. He argues that Mussolini was a revolutionary modernizer in domestic issues, but a propagandist in his foreign policy. Renzo De Felice, Fascism, an informal introduction to its theory and practice. For Italian intellectuals, the terms fascist and anti-fascist continue to be the hard currency of contemporary political debate. However, this book is important because of De Felice's vast knowledge of fascism and rigorous historical analysis. It ranges from empirical research to the history of Mussolini and the fascist regime in Italy, to seeking a definition of fascism and determining its general characteristics. Eric Norling, Revolutionary Fascism. This book consists of 5 essays in which Eric Norling examines the socialist and revolutionary aspects of Italian fascism. Anyone familiar with the work of A. James Gregor or Zeev Sternhell is aware that fascism emerged from syndicalism and was therefore a revolutionary socialist ideology. What distinguishes Norling's work is that he argues for the persistence, to one extent or another, of revolutionary socialism throughout the lifespan of Italian fascism. Richard Tador, Hitler's Revolution. This book shatters much of the school-age rhetoric we were raised on. It shifts the narrative from Hitler, the boogeyman, and moves it toward a more analytical and balanced approach. This book covers much of the strategies, drives, and designs of Hitler's domestic policy. The book does not focus on Holocaust fetishism, which is refreshing, as there was much more to this era than that, nor does it seek to promulgate in any way the same tired moralisms of Western historians. Rainer Zitelmann, Hitler's National Socialism. This book reconstructs Hitler's thought processes and objectives. It shows that Hitler developed a concept of National Socialism in which anti-capitalist ideas played a far greater role than has previously been assumed. Zitelmann shows that Hitler's anti-capitalist became increasingly radicalized and that he eventually became an admirer of Stalin's Soviet planned economy. Zitelmann shows that Hitler aimed at a racialized form of socialism in which the state held total control over the economy, and far from being a tool of German big business, as Marxists contend. Dennis J. Sweeney, Work, Race, and the Emergence of Radical Right Corporatism in Imperial Germany. The author makes a very insightful argument about the emergence of a kind of scientific racism within a new corporatism, one that brings biopolitics into German industry, an interest to all scholars and students of labor, industrial organization, ideology, political culture, and the genealogies of Nazism, all of which conformed to a corporatist conception of society. Martin Goldberg, Socialism of the Right. Socialism of the Right provides a concise analysis of various constituent groups associated with the ideology of fascism, honing in on what motivated them towards activism and governmental change. The text cites a wide array of primary materials and secondary academic pieces to construct an invaluable look into fascism. Martin Goldberg, The Truth About Mussolini and Fascism. Benito Mussolini and fascism are seen as minor footnotes beneath the shroud of German Nazism. The Italian dictator and his followers typically find themselves remanded by modern scholars to crude stereotypes of barbarism, malice, warmongering, and service to the capitalist elite, all at the expense of the working class. As it turns out, these perceptions simply do not align with the reality of pre-war Italy, or Mussolini's conduct during that period. This book pulls from both American academics and direct Italian sources. Goldberg crafts a compelling narrative about the specifics of Mussolini's campaign for peace, the work of fascism to support organized labor, and a remarkable commitment from the Duce to eradicate slavery in Africa. Perhaps most importantly, the book provides one of the few in-depth examinations of the Italian Social Republic available in the English language, making it an invaluable reference point for those curious about Italian fascism. Eugene Weber, Varieties of Fascism, Doctrines of Revolution in the 20th Century. A general discussion of fascist ideas is succeeded by short surveys of several fascist or National Socialist movements in Europe between the world wars, such as Britain, Oswald Mosley, France, Marat and Co., Belgium, de Grelle and the Rexists, Hungary, Szlasi and the Hungarian Arrow Cross, Germany, Hitler and the National Socialists, Italy, Mussolini and the Fascists, etc. Weber notes the similarities and differences while talking about each movement. The book discusses the particular characteristics of recurring aspects of fascism and how they relate to the movement as a whole. The book also evaluates the success of fascist movements in achieving their aims and the degree to which the means contributed to the desired ends. Unlike many modern works, Weber faces head-on the vexing question of fascism's utilitarian socialism and virulently anti-capitalist mentality. Weber is clear in this book that fascism is a combination of socialism and nationalism, with origins in the French Revolution. In conclusion, this book helps to correct many myths about fascism as an ideology. Antonio Costa Pinto and A. Collis Springer, Rethinking Fascism and Dictatorship in Europe. This book shows that fascism exerted a crucial ideological and political influence across Europe and beyond. It shows that fascist dictatorships shared a growing conviction that fascism was the driving force of a new post-liberal, meaning after liberalism, fiercely nationalistic and anti-communist order. The book seeks to capture, theoretically and empirically, the complex transnational dynamic between interwar dictatorships. This dynamic, involving diffusion of ideas and practices, cross-fertilization, and reflexive adaptation, muddied the boundaries between fascist and authoritarian constituencies of the interwar European right. Antonio Costa Pinto, Corporatism and Fascism, The Corporatist Wave in Europe. This book is a conceptual and comparative empirical work on the relation between corporatism and dictatorships, bringing both fields under a joint conceptual umbrella. It operationalizes the concepts of social and political corporatism, diffusion and critical junctures, and their particular application to the study of fascist-era dictatorships. This book carefully constructed balances between theory and case studies and offers an important contribution to the study of dictatorial corporatism. Howard J. Viarda, Corporatism and Comparative Politics. This work provides an excellent introduction to the ideological phenomenon of corporatism. The author explains many of the key points regarding its particular political forms, while corporatism remains distinct from both Marxism and liberalism as a quote-unquote third way. Corporatism connotes a system in which major societal groups, for example clan, ethnic, religious, economic, or military groups, are integrated into the governmental system for the purpose of achieving coordinated national development. While corporatism has proven problematic for many, given its role in various oppressive regimes in the earlier half of the 20th century, it remains a distinct political system. So to understand this phenomenon is to understand many of the modern authoritarian regimes throughout the world. Nevin Gusak, The Nazi War Against Capitalism. The Nazi War Against Capitalism is an important, detailed contribution to the discussion about the nature of Nazi economic policy. Nevin traces the intellectual origins of the Third Reich's socialism from the war socialism of World War I to the ideological roots of the early German Nazi movement. The party's interventions in the private economy are also documented at length in this book. The motivations behind the support provided by foreign and domestic capitalists to the Nazi movement are discussed, along with Berlin's predatory trade practices targeted against the American market. The trade practices and the strategic use of foreign and domestic bankers by the Nazis bore more than a passing similarity to the experience of various communist countries, such as post-Maoist China. George L. Moss, The Fascist Revolution Toward a General Theory of Fascism. This is a collection of essays from George Moss. The different essays examine different aspects of European fascism, avoiding concentrating on Germany by discussing Italian, French, Belgian, and other forms of fascism. The depth of these essays vary considerably, with the title essay being the most ambitious. Moss wrote this book with a turn towards a more cultural analysis of these movements, such as the motifs of these movements and the important role it played in winning over a wide audience. Moss also examines fascism's roots in the French Revolution, its relationship with nationalism and racism, and its use by intellectuals to foment insurrection to understand fascism on its own terms. This edition even features a critical introduction by Roger Griffin. Henry Ashby Turner Jr., German Big Business and the Rise of Hitler. Astonishingly, the subject of big business financing Hitler has never been adequately explored, and it's commonly believed that the records that might throw light on this important connection had been either lost or destroyed. But this book shows us that these records do indeed exist, and the evidence shows that big business did not support Hitler's political program, thus overthrowing many of the conventional ideas about the rise of Hitler's regime. Paul Einzig, The Economic Foundations of Fascism. This work by Einzig provides an in-depth and intricate look at the economic system of corporatism and how it functioned in Italy. The book paints a very fair and balanced picture, focusing heavily on facts and explaining things easily. Original documents have also been reproduced and translated into English in this book. Adrian Littleton, The Seizure of Power, Fascism in Italy, 1919 to 1929. This book is a study of fascism in its country of origin, Italy. It describes the impact of a new type of political movement on Italian government and society. The fascist seizure of power did not begin or end with Mussolini's famous march on Rome in 1922. It was achieved rather by gradual subversion of the liberal order, which involved not only the destruction of all political opposition, but also the creation of new institutions designed to control economic and cultural life. Günter Reimann, The Vampire Economy, Doing Business Under Fascism. The Vampire Economy is a study of the actual workings of business under Nazism, written in 1939 by the communist Günter Reimann. This work discusses the effects of heavy regulation, price controls, trade interference, economic planning, and attacks on private property, and their impact on human rights and economic development. Götz Ali, Hitler's Beneficiaries, Plunder, Racial War, and the Nazi Welfare State. In this groundbreaking book, historian Götz Ali addresses one of modern history's greatest conundrums. How did Hitler win the allegiance of ordinary Germans? Ali shows that while Jews and citizens of occupied lands suffered crippling taxation, mass looting, and destruction, most Germans enjoyed an improved standard of living. This is how Hitler channeled the proceeds into generous social programs. Hitler literally bought his people's consent. Fausto Pitiliani, The Italian Corporative State. What does a corporative state mean? What does economic fascism mean? This book answers these questions very thoroughly with this in-depth study of primary Italian sources. Pitiliani here manages to show just how successful the economic theory of corporatism was in Italy. If you're looking for the definitive book on Italian fascist economics, then this is probably the only book you need to read on this topic. Rohan Butler, The Roots of National Socialism, 1783 to 1933. This is a study of the German outlook on society from 1783 to 1933 and how it led to Nazism. In essence, the book represents an extremely comprehensive and intellectually honest study on Nazi ideology. Butler details how in Germany that Romanticism, Marxism, existentialism, and pan-Germanism all gradually fused. All these elements can be found in Mein Kampf. Butler also notes the gradual incorporation of anti-Semitism into the mainstream of German philosophy. Another important idea talked about in this book is the fact that the Nazis looked to Prussia as a model, resulting in an exhalation of militarism. William Velk, Fascist Economic Policy. Velk's interest in the subject of Italian fascism dates back to the days when, as a youth living in one of the larger Italian cities, he had the opportunity to observe at close range the early beginnings of the fascist movement and its gradual rise to power. This book is an in-depth look at the corporatist economy of Italy by a person who witnessed it himself. Armin Mohler and Karl-Heinz Weissmann, Conservative Revolution in Germany, 1918 to 1932. The Conservative Revolution in Germany, 1918 to 1932, is one of the most comprehensive, most lasting, and most influential studies of European nationalism. In particular, the 15 years in Germany between the Armistice and the rise of the Third Reich. Armin Mohler, who knew many of these figures personally, traces the development of the German ideal from Friedrich Nietzsche, Richard Wagner, Oswald Spengler, Thomas Mann, Arthur Mohler, Vandenbroek, Ernst Jünger, Carl Schmitt, and beyond. They stood in opposition to Marxism and capitalism. Some even resisted Hitler. The revolutionary conservative movement left behind a long-lasting impact on German Nazism, Italian fascism, and in the other strains of third-way ideology. In this way, it became absolutely necessary to study this intellectual movement to understand fascism. Samuel Gregg, The Commercial Society, Foundations and Challenges in a Global Age. The author utilizes sources from many traditions, such as Edmund Burke, Adam Smith, Friedrich von Hayek, and Alexis de Tocqueville. It is, in short, a book grounded firmly in various strands of the Western tradition. It studies the challenges that may have consistently impeded and occasionally undermined commercial order, including the persistence of corporatist values and political movements seeking to equalize social conditions. This book offers a historically grounded analysis for many audiences interested in philosophy or the history of economics. Franklin Hugh Adler, Italian Industrialists, From Liberalism to Fascism, The Political Development of the Industrial Bourgeoisie, 1906 to 1934. In tracing the development of industrial associations in Italy from 1906 to 1934, this study challenges traditional interpretations of the rise of fascism, unlike other studies of industrialists and fascism that begin with the post-World War I crisis. Adler reconstitutes the prior relations between industrialists and Italian liberalism, and then situates industrialists within the liberal crisis and the transition to fascism. Adler's study is theoretically informed by current interests in assessing interpretations of fascism relating corporatism to crises in liberal failures to govern society. Adler even manages to prove that communists were receiving financial aid from industrialists to crush the burgeoning fascist movement. G.D.H. Cole, Economic Planning in Fascist Italy and in Hitler's Germany. First published in 1937, this booklet explains how Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, through a plan of national self-sufficiency, came near to abolishing unemployment and brought all their productive resources into active play. Benjamin George Martin, The Nazi-Fascist New Order for European Culture. As early as 1934, the Nazis began taking steps to bring European culture into alignment with their ideological aims, in cooperation and competition with Italy's fascists. They courted filmmakers, writers, and composers from across the continent. The institutions such as the International Film Chamber, the European Writers' Union, and the Permanent Council of Composers forged a continental bloc opposed to the degenerate cosmopolitan modernism that held sway in the arts. In its place, they envisioned a Europe of nations, one that exalted traditionalism, anti-Semitism, and the Volk. Such a vision held powerful appeal for those who saw a European civilization in decline, threatened by American commercialism and Soviet Bolshevism. Roman Sporluk, Communism and Nationalism, Karl Marx versus Friedrich List. Sporluk examines the relationship between the two dominant ideologies of the 19th century, communism and nationalism. Sporluk argues that both Karl Marx's theory of communism and Friedrich List's theory of nationalism arose in response to the sweeping changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution, and that both sought to promote industrialization as a means of reforming the modern world. Each ideology, the author contends, developed in relation to the other and can best be understood as the product of a complex interweaving of the two, producing in the 20th century new forms of nationalism that have incorporated Marxism into the fabric of their movements, and Marxist states that have adopted threads of nationalistic belief, casting the role of Liszt and the intellectual development of Marx in an unorthodox light. This book adds a new dimension to the debate over the boundaries of nationalism and socialism in the development of political ideologies. Brendan Sims, Hitler, a Global Biography. Hitler offers a deeply learned and radically revisionist biography, arguing that the dictator's main strategic enemy from the start of his political career in the 1920s was not communism or the Soviet Union, but capitalism and the United States. Whereas most historians have argued that Hitler underestimated the American threat, Sims shows that Hitler embarked on a preemptive war with the United States precisely because he considered it such a potent adversary. The war against the Jews was driven both by his anxiety about combating the supposed forces of international plutocracy and by a broader desire to maintain the domestic cohesion he thought necessary for survival on the international scene. Nicholas Farrell, Mussolini, A New Life. In this biography, the talented writer and journalist Nicholas Farrell has created an admirable study of the Italian fascist leader and dictator Benito Mussolini. How did Mussolini manage to take power and hold on to it for 2 decades? What inspired Churchill to call him the Roman genius, and Pope Pius XI to say he was sent by Providence? And how did Mussolini successfully curtail democracy without using mass murder to stay in command? Was fascism bourgeois or proletarian? Well, Farrell here answers everything. Conclusion. This compendium serves to assist students of fascism and aid their studies. Note that all of these works were written by authors who did not have a political slant in their written observations of fascism. With these works, you can become an expert in the field and debunk any of the usual falsehoods that are associated with the ideology. With that, I'll now cut this off with the final quote. Fascism is a war on intellectualism. The fascist spirit is will, not intellect. And I hope I will not be misunderstood. Fascist intellectuals must not be intellectuals. Fascism is and should be an enemy without truce or pity, not against intelligence, but against intellectualism, which is a disease of intelligence. For intelligence, too, is will, and fascism at least feels this, disdaining the culture that is an ornament or adornment of the brain, and longing for a culture by which the spirit is armed and fortified for winning over new battles. And this should be our barbarity, a barbarity, moreover, of intellectuals, against science, and above all, against philosophy. But, of course, against the science and philosophy of decadence, of the spineless, of those who always stand in the window and are satisfied to criticize as if it were no affair to theirs. Giovanni Gentile.
Who was Benito Mussolini?
He was the father of fascism, the iron-fisted dictator who ruled Italy for more than 2 decades.
Io sarò alla vostra testa. precisi di Hitler e mettere la nostra volontà di sanarli. Scendiamo in campo contro le democrazie plutocratiche e reazionarie dell'Occidente. Popolo italiano, corri alle armi!